Hello and welcome to this edition of The Leading Issue. I'm Francke, the Chief Executive of CMI, and today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome as my guest Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. She was the 27th Prime Minister from 2010 until 2013, the first woman ever to serve in that role. And amongst other roles, Julia now serves as the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, which through research, practice, and advocacy is addressing women's underrepresentation in leadership. Welcome, Julia. I'm delighted to have you with us today.
Great to be with you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you. So give us, I know you've been Prime Minister, but give us the whistle-stop tour of your career, perhaps what led you into politics in the first place, and what are you focusing on at the moment?
Sure, I'll try and do the whistle-stop tour. I'm not from a political family. I didn't think about being in politics when I was young, but I was brought up in a family that very much valued education. I was born in the United Kingdom. My family's Welsh. They migrated to Australia for a better life. Neither of my parents got to finish secondary school, and they drummed into my sister and I, you've got to get a great education. It's a privilege. You've got to make the most of it. And I did make the most of it. I loved school, and I got to go on to university to study law and arts at Adelaide University. And in my second year there were some big cutbacks to university funding. And I thought from my background, that was wrong and that it jeopardised the ability of kids like me to get a university education. So to absolutely whistle-stop it, it was involvement in that campaign against those cutbacks that led me on a pathway of public and policy advocacy, initially through student unionism, and then people started saying to me, you should think about politics, and ultimately I did. And I was elected to the federal parliament, getting to serve as Minister for Education and ultimately as Prime Minister. In the years since, I've been pursuing the causes close to my heart, the politics of opportunity, and certainly pursuing gender equality, because I've been an active feminist all of my life, and I think I learned some things about women and leadership serving as Australia's first female Prime Minister. So in this phase of my life, I do chair the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. We have a sister institute at the Australian National University in Canberra. I have the enormous privilege of chairing the board of directors of the Wellcome Trust, the Health and Medical Research Fund, which would be familiar to many, and many would also have visited the Wellcome Collection on Euston Road. I do too have a range of commercial engagements. So it's a pretty varied portfolio, gets to exercise different parts of my brain and keep me in touch with what people are thinking and feeling and doing.
Which is great. And it's nice to see that lifelong thread of educational advocacy, opportunity advocacy, and of course, gender advocacy. And tell us, what are the issues that the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is trying to tackle and address?
Well, we're trying to tackle the big picture problem, which is, even though we continue to make progress on gender equality, whether that's in politics, more women in politics, more women in the senior levels of business, whether it's how women are portrayed in the media, and the list goes on, whilst we do continue to make progress, the rate of progress is far too slow. The World Economic Forum every year generates statistics, and they always tell us that it will be more than 100 years before we reach gender equality globally at the current rate of change, and that is far too long to wait. We're also seeing some retrenchment in community attitudes. We do polling each year with the great global polling company Ipsos, and year after year that polling data is telling us that there are significant sections of the community that think that gender equality has already gone too far, and we are particularly seeing conservative and negative attitudes rising amongst young men. So this isn't an easy world in which we can just happily say each new generation will be better on gender equality than the generation that went before. We are a research institute. We do work with the business community. We also enjoy philanthropic support from the business community, which enables us to do more. And so I'm always interested to meet with business leaders who want to solve the gender equality problem and who are prepared to be supportive of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership in that journey.
Yeah, that research that you mentioned, I have seen at your events, especially the research showing that many men, and especially younger men, think that gender equality has gone too far. Alas, CMI has similar research. What do you think is driving that polarization, and especially perhaps amongst young people, and what can we do about it?
We would really like to marshal the resources to do a deep evaluative dive into what is going on with young men. I mean, the polling data we have, there is other polling data available. You've referred to some that CMI has done. And if you were going to summarise the threads from all of that polling data, it would tell us that the gender divide in political attitudes amongst young people, and we're talking like 18 to 25-year-olds, that the gender divide is more than it's ever been before. Young women are tending to be very progressive, very left-leaning in their politics. Young men are tending to be more conservative, to believe gender equality has gone too far, and that they express, not the majority of them, but a significant subsection, express attitudes like, and we've asked this question in polling, if a man stays home to look after his children, is he less of a man? And more young men will say yes to that question than men over 60. So there is something going on. What is it? Not sure. I would suggest probably online influencers, the type that are selling subjugation of women as part of their brand of masculinity. There's something going on there that's affecting attitudes. I think there may be something arising from early access to violent pornography, and the statistics about how many 10-year-olds have seen violent pornography are truly hair-raising. And unfortunately, this is now routinely available to teenagers. But I also think perhaps the work we've all been doing to uplift women and girls, and the very visible programs for girls in schools, have perhaps bred some resentment, and we haven't managed to get the message across that a gender equal world will actually be better for everyone. And so I think there are some things for us to reflect on about how we better include young men in this pathway of change.
Yeah, that's an important point. That, you know, if women rise in leadership positions, it tends to be better for everybody. And what you're basically saying is that's a message that we perhaps haven't instilled enough or said enough in our advocating.
I think that's right. I think we've unfortunately reinforced a narrative that this is somehow a zero-sum game. And I actually think a lot of contemporary community concern about a whole range of issues starts from the premise that this is a zero-sum game, that more for you means less for me, and that's just the way it is. Whereas when we look at all of the research, including the research we've done at the Global Institute on gender equality, it tells us that a gender equal world will be better for men and better for women. It will enable men to have more pathways open to them. I mean, you imagine now if you were in conversation, say, with a 14-year-old boy, and you ask that stereotypical adult question, what do you want to do when you leave school? And if he said, oh, I really want to be a childcare worker, you know, I think, to be frank, you'd be taken aback by that answer. And there would be many adults that he would give that answer to who would say, why do you want to do that? I mean, you know, they would be thinking in the back of their brains, that's kind of women's work. So, you know, gender equality will give men a full array of choices as well as giving women a full array of choices. And the economic research tells us very clearly that a gender equal world will be a more prosperous world. And the work done by those who focus on women, peace and security a gender equal world will be a more peaceful world as well. So these are great gains for all of us that we can realise together.
Absolutely. And speaking about business and other organizations, what we've found is that when you do include men in your efforts, so very proactively include men, you actually do make more progress. And indeed, many men, just as you say, will say, you know what, I perhaps don't have to behave like the alpha male all the time, or I can show my emotions. And it tends to improve organizational cultures. What are the other things that organizations can do to encourage more women into senior positions apart from including men?
Yep. Most organisations that we talk to and work with are fine at the intake level. There are still some organisations that need very specialist technical skills where the pipeline is still very male skewed. But for most organisations, that's not the problem. At the intake level, they're 50% men and women. Indeed, some organisations are more than 50% women at the intake level because the tertiary courses, like law in the contemporary age, are more women than men. And yet, when they look at progression through into the mid-range and then into the more senior range, they're losing the women. And, we think that requires organisations to do a lot of their own bespoke looking at their statistics and to try and work out where the pinch points are in their organisation and why they're losing women. But common explanations include not getting work-life balance right and not facilitating good returns to work for women who have taken time off for parenting leave, skewing definitions of merit, making presentism, being in the office for long hours, always at the boss's elbow, a key requisite for getting promoted rather than looking at outcomes. Networks of power and influence, often informal networks that still skew male and therefore make it more likely that when they're talking about promotion, the names that most quickly come to mind that are on the tip of their tongue are male names. Some cultural questions, some toxicity in the culture that might be there in the form of microaggressions, might even be there much more visibly than that, which make women feel excluded, how the workplace socialises, who it includes, how it includes them, whether meetings are run on the basis of who's got the strongest voice. All of those things need to be worked through. It won't be, we're past the days where the solutions are obvious. Most organisations have done all of the obvious things already. Now we're digging for the more subtle barriers, needing to find them and then needing to address them.
Yes, and there is unfortunately no silver bullet, as you've said, listing out a number of factors that could influence that. But I'm interested as well in one that you mentioned, obviously, in the post-COVID work era, we are having organizations along the spectrum. Some are saying, I'm fine with remote working. Some are saying, well, I want a balance of in the office and remote working, so the hybrid. And some are saying, get back to the office 5 days a week. Based on your remarks there, do you think those get back into the office 5 days a week organizations are less likely to have diverse gender leadership than those that are more flexible?
Not necessarily. When we look at this question, what we actually find is everybody talks about flexibility, but perhaps what is more important is predictability. For people who have caring responsibilities, young children, older relatives, perhaps both, it's predictability that matters the most. And so, if you were in that situation and I was your employer and I said to you, look, every Wednesday night I'm going to need you to work late, I'm going to need you to work till 8 o'clock at night, then you could plan your life and your caring responsibilities so that there were arrangements in place to make sure your children, your older relatives had care that one night a week you knew you were going to be late. What is much, much harder to manage is if I say to you at 4:30 in the afternoon, I don't know what you had planned this evening, but now I need you to stay till 8 o'clock tonight. That turning on a dime, rearranging everything. Obviously, in a huge emergency at work, people can manage to do those things, but to be asked to do that routinely, not to have predictability, that is what really disrupts family life and caring patterns. So I don't think that there's one right answer here. I do think, though, that for employers who are offering mixed modalities and allowing employees a lot of choice and flexibility, they may well think they're doing the right thing. They may well be doing the right thing. But if the outcome of that is that the men disproportionately come into the office and the women disproportionately work from home, and then you don't adjust your ideas about merit, so presenteeism is still kind of looming large in deciding who you think is doing a good job, then that is going to only end one way, and that is that we're skewing merit and promotions towards the men who are coming in. And I do think whenever we have this conversation, we've got to say, obviously, workplaces need to be doing a series of things, but there are many issues to be working through on the home front because domestic labour, caring labour is still unequally distributed.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point. It's actually that holistic home and work environment that actually is important that we address to improve gender equality. So how much of the focus on gender equality stems from your own career and experiences? How much of your focus?
Yeah, a bit of both. I mean, I was someone who, from my earliest age, from being a school kid, thought that boys and girls, women and men were equal. I mean, maybe that's a legacy of a family home where there was just my sister and I. We didn't have a brother. And so there was no kind of visible discrimination in the home. My sister and I were taught to aim with ambition about our future careers and lives. We were not taught that the sum total of our life would be about getting married, having children. Now, given, I was born in 1961, that's not a given. Many girls of my generation would have been told, don't worry too much about this work thing, hitting the books too hard, life will be about family and caring. We weren't taught that. So I emerged into my adulthood with this inherent sense that men and women should be treated equally. Whenever I saw unequal treatment, I thought it was wrong. I thought this was an issue the whole world was onto and we'd get about fixing it pretty quickly. That hasn't proved to be the case. And then, of course, in politics, I had a set of experiences because I'm of that generation of Labor women that we were re-gearing the system to make it easier for women to get pre-selected to come into the parliament. We did achieve that. The current Labor government in Australia is actually more than 50% women in its parliamentary ranks. But still, when I got to the top job and to be the first woman to hold it as Prime Minister, there was a world of gender stereotyping around me with a viciousness to it that I must admit I hadn't really expected. I thought we'd moved further along the path than that. And coming out of those experiences, I've written about them, I've talked about them, but I wanted to make a deeper contribution than that, and that's what led me to found the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, firstly at King's College London, and then delighted to see the sister institute in Australia.
Yeah, so it is very much also to do with your own personal experiences, and it's very interesting too. Rachel Reeves talks about the influence in her early career of being a chess champion and, facing boys. And they said to her, "Oh, you lucked out. You've got the girl." And then she says, I made sure I beat him. Um, and so she says she was a feminist before she was a politician. And it sounds like the same is true of you. But in your political career, I've read that you had the most successful policy pass rate of any Australian PM. So how would you describe your leadership style? And, how did that influence your ability to get things done?
Well, firstly, I've always been a purpose-driven sort of person, wanting to be clear about what I'm trying to achieve. And in the government I led, we were very clear about what we were trying to achieve. And so a clear policy agenda, I think, helps propel you through. I led a minority government, so that meant that I always needed to be in discussion with others in the parliament to secure my legislative agenda. But, I think leadership style-wise, I'm used to working with people. I'm used to welding people into a team, listening, recognising that people have different interests and concerns, accommodating those as much as you possibly can. And that did mean, as a result, that we were able to weld the coalition that supported the government into parliamentary numbers that produce nation-changing reforms and a big volume of legislation. And so I'm particularly proud that we legislated things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, which profoundly changed the lives of Australians with disabilities. We were able to do things like set up an emissions trading system so that Australia could better deal with climate change. We were able to get through some very major education reforms, and the list went on. We were able to start a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse that has led to a series of recommendations which will keep our children safer in the future. So we tackled some big issues. Not all of that work survives. Obviously, climate change continues to be a very partisan question in Australia, but it was a government with a very productive track record.
Yes, most certainly. And obviously, you then in 2012 made your very famous speech. 10 years on, and you released the book, Not Now, Not Ever, which looked at the progress, a collection of essays on progress we've made in that decade. You've talked about it being too slow, but what about the treatment of women in the public eye? Do you think that that's improved now for people in the political arena and in public roles?
I think it's a bit better and a bit worse all at the same time. What's a bit better is the traditional media, the newspapers, the radio shows, the TV channels. I think they are much more careful now than they used to be about how they describe women and report on women leaders. By no means flawless, errors are still made. But some of the things that happened to me routinely when I was Prime Minister, constant reporting of what I was wearing, even if I was at an international meeting, say with NATO, reports would be led with what I was wearing. That, I think, traditional media are far less likely to do now. Mm-hmm. But, and unfortunately there has to be a but in this sentence, but we've seen the rise of social media as the way in which so many people get their political information. And social media for women is a very ugly form of the Wild West, where it's no holds barred. There is research into this. There's been research done by Amnesty International. They look at all of the social media posts about parliamentarians, about people in the House of Commons, and it shows very, very clearly that of the hugely ugly things that get said, and I'm talking about things like death threats and rape threats, they are disproportionately said about women, and they are disproportionately said about women of colour.
Yes. So as you rightly say, there is some progress, and there's also some steps backward. And one of the things that we've found in research we're releasing this summer is that um, when you train managers, and we have to bear in mind that 82% of people promoted into managerial positions do not get trained. We call those the accidental managers. But trained managers tend to behave more inclusively, do some of the things that you referenced in your own leadership style, listen, engage people with different views, be willing to build teams, and that this actually promotes a greater sense of engagement and a greater culture of inclusivity. Um, how do you think, what makes a good boss today? And have you seen that change over time? Um, since perhaps you were Australian Prime Minister, and what do you think good and bad behaviors look like in leadership?
I think once again here it's like we're seeing, two very different ends of the spectrum growing, and that's kind of odd. I do think that in many businesses, many organisations, people get it that the era of command and control leadership, of bosses yelling and throwing things at staff, those days are over, they're gone. If people behave like that, there are consequences. I think people recognise that in the war for talent, what a lot of talented individuals, particularly young people, but not just young people, are looking for in a team leader, in a boss, is a coach, mentor, captain, amalgam. They want someone who listens to them, who's got their best interests at heart, is prepared to nurture them, is prepared to show some empathy. I think that is a growing style and brand of leadership. And I am not a believer, and the research is very clear on this, there is not inherently baked biologically into men and women different leadership styles. But because women are socialised to show empathy, to be nurturing, to listen more, often women fit with that leadership style a little bit more easily. Doesn't mean that there aren't men who do it well. Doesn't mean that people can't be trained to do it, but it is a style I think many women fall into. And yet at the other end of the spectrum, we are clearly seeing, and this is on the political stage, but it's also at the head of some of the most noted global companies, male visions of leadership which are egocentric, about self, often correlated with bad behaviour, a preparedness to do and say provocative things. And tragically, I think we are seeing people warm to that strong man sort of vision of leadership. So we've got this quite bifurcated approach at the moment.
Uh-huh. And well, would you say that's certainly that seems to me to be reflected in the political landscape, and we can see that emerging around us. And how do you think that politics is changing in the world that we're in today? And what are some of the trends that you see there, both good and less good?
Mm-hmm. I think what we've seen, across, it was partially true when I was there, but it's growing over time. What we're certainly seeing this century is increasing polarisation in politics. And I think that there's a swirling series of things all going on at once. This is a complicated world with a fast rate of change. People have been subject to a series of external shocks, the global financial crisis, the pandemic, technological change, now AI, war breaking out, obviously, in Europe, Ukraine, but war very, very visibly on our TV screens too, Israel, Gaza. All of this is making people feel very unsteady about the world in which we live and very pessimistic about the future. And polling does show that people, when asked the question, do you think your children will get to live a better life than you have, that the trend line in answering that is going down. So people have got less hope about the future. So I think there's this restlessness amongst populations about we're in a difficult spot and no one seems to have the answer. At the same time, with the rise of social media as the vehicle for political information, social media doesn't do nuance, it doesn't do complexity, it doesn't do shades of grey. What prospers on social media is the, clearest, simplest, most hard-hitting line. And so it's hard in social media for the centre to hold. Instead, what holds or gets people's attention is the extremes. And so by the time you refract that back into a community that's looking for solutions, I think that is driving polarisation where people lurch, potentially left, potentially right, but to a more populist, to use the terminology, I don't particularly like that terminology, but to use the understood terminology, more populist modes of leadership, cut-through lines, simple solutions. And yet we know that whilst those cut-through lines and simple solutions might hold sway on social media, they're not going to work in the real world.
No. And it's amazing the difference in how people behave in person versus the things that they will do and say when they're hiding behind their social media accounts. And as you say, it's a lot more ruthless and very one-dimensional, which is most unfortunate. But I want to go back to obviously in this country we're in an election mode, and actually one of the planks of the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, still Shadow Chancellor, we'll see, is she wants to close the gender pay gap. Which is a very ambitious goal. Certainly, we've referred to the WEF's 100 years to close the gender pay gap for gender equality. If you wanted to really accelerate that glacial progress, what are some of the things that you think we really must do?
We've done some research at the Global Institute on gender pay legislation. So gender pay gap legislation, the reporting legislation around the world. Obviously, we've got it in the UK here. We've got it in Australia. We looked at it in a number of countries. And we drilled out of that some lessons about what the best forms of reporting are. And happily, the Australian government then did build on our research and enact some of those reforms. And I think the UK is a long way down this track. But the research is telling us that you do need to be clear publicly about individual results from businesses. Now, obviously, there will be a size thing there. You can't go down to really small businesses, but for major businesses, for them to have their gender pay gap results publicly reported, so you can have a conversation about what is happening at Smith & Jones Limited, which is driving their gender pay gap. Why is it like that? And then requiring businesses to be very clear on what they are doing to make a difference to that gender pay gap within their organisation, and then reporting on progress against that plan. So it's, yes, a bit name and shame. It might also be name and celebrate for businesses that are doing it well, but there's an action component to it. So I'd certainly be recommending that. And then I think we have to recognise, and this is obviously more complicated from the point of view of government, that there are historic pay inequities baked into our system. Things that were viewed as, may still be viewed as women's work, caring work, have been historically undervalued. And the only way of addressing that ultimately is through pay equity cases. So to give you an example of that from Australia, when I was Prime Minister, there was a case taken for social workers, for social and community workers, so the sorts of workers who would be in places like women's refuges. They were graduates, they've got degrees, but they were, 30% underpaid compared with what graduates in other fields were likely to be paid. And that was basically because this had been characterised over many years as, women's work, caring work, not, sort of academic in a, crunchy sense. That was how it was stereotyped. And that needed to be swept away, and it was swept away by the taking of a pay equity case.
Yeah, no, I think those are all good things. We also think there should be consequences for firms that, despite several years of reporting, don't make any progress, but still put in their annual report how committed they are. Well, now, Julia, you've worked across public, private, third sector organizations. Do you think that successful leaders differ across those organizations, or do you think that the good qualities of leadership are fairly universal?
I think good qualities of leadership are fairly universal, but politics requires some additional things. Many business leaders are very publicly exposed. Many choose to be quite publicly exposed, but it is not routine for business leaders to be as publicly exposed as politicians are, to need to go and make their case, for their very jobs, for the opportunity to deliver change in public with, millions and millions, tens of millions of people needing to vote for you if your political party is going to get the opportunity to govern. So I think that there's a communications burden for politicians, which is not as heavily on the shoulders of private sector leaders. There's, public exposure questions in another sense too. I mean, it's really only politics that could have you sitting at the table of the G20 one day, hobnobbing with, President Biden and whoever else, and a couple of days later in your constituency, handing out leaflets in and around the train station, talking to people about things that worry them in their own lives. Business leaders don't routinely have to show that degree of flexibility. So I think there are some additional things in politics that matter.
Yes, including having a very thick skin, right?
A very thick skin.
Well, we like to ask all our guests, what do you think? And you've touched on many things, but if you were to single out one of the leading issues, perhaps for you, the most important leading issue facing us today in the world, what would it be?
I mean, I think in this world, issues are so connected. I could easily say gender equality because it's a cross-cutting issue across, peace, security, climate change, the whole lot. But if I can sneak to, in addition to gender equality, clearly the pressing challenge of climate change is one for the global community and one we are not addressing at the pace needed, whether that's through the mechanisms of politics and the various COP meetings that are held year by year, last year in Dubai. We are not making the progress in those forums that we need to. And the business community is not making the progress it needs to either. We need to do more.
Yeah, and I agree with both of those points. And actually, if we were to do more together, back to your original point, less polarization, more collaboration, we'd probably accelerate the rate of progress on all of these issues. Well, Julia, thank you so much for joining us today. Inspirational as ever. and very wonderful to hear your views on these topics. And thank you again for joining us on The Leading Issue.
Thank you very much, Anne.